Welcome to Moonlit Bonds from Dusk Chapters. Tonight's full-length story is The Amber Hive. Settle in, get comfortable, and enjoy. Chapter 1. The morning mist still clung low over Fenbrook when Mari Vane knelt among her grandmother's hives, listening for a hum that would not come. She told herself it was only the cold. Early autumn had come sharp and sudden this year, biting the pumpkin vines in the kitchen garden and turning the birches along the lane the color of candle flame, and bees always quieted when the air cooled. That was what Hazel would have said, kneeling in this very spot with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her silver hair escaping its braid. Bees know the season better than we do, love. Trust them. But Mari had trusted them her whole life, and she knew, the way she knew the weight of a full super or the particular ache in her shoulders after a day of lifting frames, that this was not the ordinary hush of the year turning. This was something else. Something wrong. She eased the lid from the nearest hive, moving slow and careful the way Hazel had taught her, and peered down into the box. A handful of bees crawled across the top bars, sluggish, their wings dulled to a papery gray instead of the bright amber-black shimmer they ought to have had. No one came to investigate her shadow falling over the entrance. No one rose to meet her breath. In a healthy hive there would have been a ripple of sound and motion at the disturbance, 1,000 small bodies moving as one, alert and busy and alive. Here there was only a tired stirring, like sleepers roused against their will. Mari sat back on her heels in the wet grass and pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth. 6 hives left, out of the 11 her grandmother had kept at the height of her days. 6, and every one of them thinner and stranger than the last since Hazel Vane had died this past spring, slipping away in her sleep with the peculiar smile of someone who'd heard something sweet in a dream. Mari had woken that morning to a silence in the house so complete it had frightened her before she even understood why, and she had understood, walking out to the apiary in her nightgown with her bare feet numb in the dew, that the hives had gone quiet at the very same hour, as if they, too, had felt her grandmother leave the world. She had told no one that part. The village had enough to whisper about already. "You'll want cleaning out and feeding, the pair of you," she murmured to the 2 weakest boxes, replacing the lid gently. I know it's been a hard year." She rested her palm flat against the sun-warmed wood for a moment, the way she'd seen Hazel do 1,000 times, as though the gesture alone might say something the bees could understand. Then she rose, brushed the grass from her knees, and went to find her smoker and her hive tool, because whatever was wrong with them, starving was not going to be the thing that finished it. The apiary sat at the far eastern edge of the Vane property, in the last cleared meadow before the land rose and thickened into the dark tangle of Thistlemore Wood. Mari had grown up with that tree line at the corner of her eye the way other children grew up with a mountain or a river, a fixed and looming fact of the landscape, and like every child in Fenbrook, she had been told from her earliest years not to go past the old stone marker, where the meadow grass gave way to bracken and shadow. Wolves lived in Thistlemore. Not ordinary wolves, the village never said so plainly, not even to its own children, but everyone understood the shape of what wasn't said. Golden-eyed things that walked sometimes on 2 legs and sometimes on 4, that kept to their own laws and their own lodge somewhere deep in the dark of the pines, and that Fenbrook had learned, generations back, to leave entirely alone. Hazel had never seemed afraid of the wood. If anything, she had planted her hives closer to it than any other beekeeper for 3 villages around, angling the entrances toward the tree line as though she wanted her bees to fly that way, and she had death-gripped only one rule about it in all Mari's years under her roof. Never go into Thistlemore after dusk. Not for anything. Mari had never once heard her explain why, and Hazel was 3 seasons in the ground now with all her reasons buried alongside her. Mari straightened, propping the smoker against the workbench under the eaves, and let her eyes travel over the tree line the way they always did when she'd been thinking about her grandmother too long. The wood looked the same as it always had, dense and green-black and utterly unbothered by her. The pines swaying faintly, though there was no wind, she could feel down here in the meadow. She had walked its edge 100 times, gathering the wild moonbriar that grew nowhere else nearby, close enough to see between the trunks, but never past the marker stone, and in all that time nothing in there had ever so much as rustled at her. Still, the villagers watched that tree line with narrowed eyes whenever they passed her gate, and lately they watched Mari the same way, as though proximity to Thistlemore might have rubbed off on her like pollen on a sleeve. "Fine bit of land you're sitting on, all the same," old Corwin the miller had said to her only last week, leaning on his cart at the crossroads with an expression that wanted to be kindly and mostly managed to be pitying instead. "Shame to see it go to waste out there on the edge of the wood, a young woman alone. There's them in the village would take it off your hands fair enough, if the bees don't work out. Fresh starts no shame, Mari." She had thanked him with a tight smile and walked on, because there was no arguing with Corwin, or with anyone else in Fenbrook who'd started saying variations of the same thing since the reading of Hazel's will. The debts were real. She wouldn't insult herself by pretending otherwise. Her grandmother had spent her last years pouring what little coin she had into keeping the hives fed through 2 hard winters, and Mari had inherited both the empty larder and the unpaid balance at the miller's and the chandler's along with the land itself. A good offer for the property, house, meadow, and all that troublesome wood-adjacent acreage would have solved every one of those problems inside a week. She had turned down 3 such offers already this year. It wasn't sense that made her do it. She knew that. Sense would have taken the coin, paid what was owed, and found some smaller cottage nearer the village green where the neighbors didn't lower their voices when she walked by. But sense had never once explained to her why Hazel loved this land so fiercely, why she'd spoken of the bees as though they were kin rather than livestock, why she'd hummed old wordless tunes to them on summer evenings that Mari still caught herself humming without meaning to. If Mari sold the apiary, she would be selling the last living piece of her grandmother left in the world. Not a portrait or a ring or a shelf of dusty ledgers, but a breathing, humming, temperamental thing that had loved Hazel back. She could not do it, not while there was a single frame of brood left to save. She spent the rest of the gray morning working down the row of hives, scraping burr-comb, checking for mold in the damp corners of the boxes, murmuring reassurances she was no longer sure she believed. The weakest hive, the one that held what remained of her grandmother's finest queen, old and dark and strangely marked, a line Hazel had kept going for longer than Mari had been alive, was worse than yesterday. Barely a double handful of workers left to tend her, when there should have been thousands. Mari closed the lid slowly and stood a long moment with her forehead against the rough wood, breathing in the smoke and honey smell of it, listening to that faint, failing hum. "I don't know what's wrong with you," she whispered, "but I'm not letting go. Not of you, not of any of it, whatever it takes." Behind her, at the tree line, the branches of Thistlemore would stir again in a wind she still could not feel, and for one strange instant Mari could have sworn the whole dark wall of pines seemed to be listening. Chapter 2. The gray morning gave way to a grayer afternoon, and by the time the sun sank low enough to bleed orange through the pines, the weak hive had not improved. If anything, the hum inside it had thinned further, a sound like a held breath about to give out. Mari stood at her workbench long after she should have gone in for supper, turning over what little she knew. Hazel's ledgers spoke of moonbriar the way other beekeepers spoke of clover or goldenrod, an ordinary forage if a stubborn one, prized for the deep amber cast it gave the honey and the strange vigor it seemed to lend a failing colony. A dose of moonbriar tea in autumn keeps a queen through the coldest months, her grandmother had written in her slanted hand. 20 years ago. Asterisk, mind you don't go picking after dark. Wait for morning, whatever you do. Asterisk, whatever you do. Mari had read that line 100 times without ever asking why. Hazel had never explained it, only repeated it, the way she repeated warnings about lightning and thin ice, absolute and unexamined. And Hazel was not here to ask anymore, and the moonbriar that grew at the wood's edge in the village had all but vanished this year, choked out by something Mari couldn't name, while deeper in Thistlemore Wood, she had seen it herself, from the safety of her own fence line. The pale flowers still grew thick and silver blue as smoke. She told herself she was only going to look, only to the first stand of it, no more than a few dozen steps past the tree line, where the old stone wall marking her grandmother's land gave way to bracken and shadow. She would be back before true dark. She packed a shallow basket, tied on her boots, and did not let herself think too hard about the rule as she climbed over the low wall and into the wood. The trees swallowed the last of the daylight almost at once. Fenbrook's fields had been broad and gold and ordinary, full of the sounds of supper fires and dogs barking at nothing, but Thistlemore Wood was another country entirely. Old growth, black-barked and close, the canopy knitted so tight overhead that dusk came early and stayed heavy. The village children dared each other to the wall and never passed it. The old men at the tavern lowered their voices when they mentioned the wolves that ran these trees, as though the pines themselves might carry word back. Mari had grown up half a field from that wall and never once set foot beyond it. Her heart beat a nervous, thickened rhythm now, keeping time with her footsteps as she picked her way over root and stone, her lantern unlit and tucked under her arm, because some instinct told her that light would be worse than dark, would announce her more surely than the crack of a branch underfoot. The moonbriar, when she found it, glowed. There was no other word for it. A low drift of pale flowers spilled between two mossy boulders, each blossom faintly luminous in the gathering gloom, as though it had swallowed moonlight all summer and only now let it go. Mari knelt and began cutting stems with her small knife, her fingers quick and careful, and for a moment the strangeness of the wood receded before the simple, grounding work of harvest, snip, gather, lay in the basket, snip again, the same motions Hazel had taught her over the bee yard 100 times. She had perhaps a third of the basket full when the wood went silent. It was not a sound stopping. It was the absence beneath all sounds, the small chittering of insects, the whisper of leaves, the distant complaint of a night bird, all of it gone at once, as if the forest itself had drawn a breath and held it. Mari's knife stilled in her hand, the hair along her arms lifted. She rose slowly, basket clutched to her chest, and turned in a careful circle, straining her eyes against the dark. Nothing moved among the boulders. Nothing moved along the black seam of the deer trail behind her. And yet she had the sudden, complete certainty of being watched, the kind of certainty that lived in the base of the skull rather than the eyes, older than reason. "Hello," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded, swallowed whole by the trees. Something shifted in the bracken to her left. Not the quick scurry of a rabbit or fox, but something low and deliberate and large, a weight moving with terrible patience. Mari's breath caught. She took one step backward, toward the way she had come, and the moonbriar basket trembled in her grip. The wolf stepped out from between the boulders as though the shadows themselves had decided to take shape. He was enormous, far larger than any wolf she had heard described in the tavern's fireside stories, larger than seemed possible for anything with fur and 4 legs, his coat a deep, banked charcoal that seemed to drink the last of the light rather than reflect it. His shoulders alone stood higher than her waist. He should have terrified her outright, should have sent her scrambling back over the wall with her heart lodged in her throat, and some far corner of her mind insisted that this was exactly what a sensible woman would do. But she could not move, because his eyes had found hers. They were amber, not the muddy gold of an ordinary wolf's eyes caught in torchlight, but a rich, burning amber, like sunlight trapped inside good honey, like the last color at the heart of a dying fire. And the moment they fixed on her, something happened in Mari's chest that she had no name for, a warmth, sudden and total, blooming outward from somewhere behind her ribs, flooding down through her arms and up into her throat until her eyes stung with the shock of it. It was not fear. It was not, quite, anything she had ever felt before, a recognition so deep it bypassed thought altogether, as though some sleeping part of her had been shaken gently awake and told, "There you are at last." The wolf went utterly still. His ears, which had been flat and alert, rose. His weight, which had been coiled low as if for a spring, eased back onto all four paws. For a long moment neither of them breathed. The wood around them held its silence, holding them both in it, and Mari would swear afterward that she felt the ground itself hum faintly beneath her boots, an echo of the same low vibration she felt each morning with her hand pressed flat against a healthy hive. His nostrils flared. He took one slow step toward her, then another, his great head lowering not in menace, but in something that looked absurdly, almost like a bow, and Mari's basket of moonbriar slid from suddenly nerveless fingers and struck the moss without her ever hearing it land. "You," she whispered, though she could not have said what she meant by it, only that the word rose up out of her on its own, unbidden, true. The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. Amber eyes held gray, unblinking, and the warmth in her chest did not fade but deepened, spreading now into something that felt dangerously close to longing, absurd and impossible as that was to feel for a creature that could tear out her throat in half a heartbeat, and clearly had not the slightest intention of doing so. A twig snapped somewhere off in the dark, some other, ordinary sound of the wood, and it broke whatever spell had held them both rooted. The wolf's head came up sharply. He looked past her, once, toward the deep interior of the trees, and something in his posture shifted from stillness into wariness, a shepherd's alertness rather than a hunter's. When his gaze came back to her, it seemed, impossibly, almost apologetic. Then he was gone, not fled, exactly, but withdrawn, melting back between the boulders with a silence that should have belonged to something far smaller, leaving only the impression of amber eyes burned behind Mari's own, and the moonbriar scattered pale and glowing at her feet, and her heart hammering now, at last, now that there was nothing left in the clearing to still it. She did not remember picking up her basket. She did not remember climbing back over the low stone wall, though her palms would ache faintly the next morning with the memory of rough granite. She came to herself properly only on her own side of the fence, in her own dooryard, moonbriar clutched to her chest and her breath tearing ragged in her throat, staring back at the black wall of thistlemore wood as though it might yet produce some explanation. The trees gave her none. They only stood, dark and patient, keeping whatever secret had just looked at her with a wolf's amber eyes and left her feeling, for one impossible heartbeat, entirely known. Chapter 3. Mari told herself, walking back through the dark toward her own lit window, that it had been a trick of moonlight and nerves. "You're going to wear a groove in that cup," Ianthe said from the doorway, and he did not startle, because he had heard her coming from 3 rooms off, the particular quiet tread of a second, who moved through the lodge at night the way a shadow moved across water. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "I gathered." She came and settled into the chair opposite, tucking her feet up under her the way she'd done since she was a half-grown pup trailing after him through these same halls, though she wore 30 winters now, and the rank marks of a second at her collar. Firelight caught the gray-brown of her hair, the sharp assessing look she leveled at him, the same look she'd give a fence line she suspected wasn't holding. You went out on the West Patrol and came back different. I could smell it on you at the door. What happened out there, Reese? He should have told her some smaller truth. That the deer were thin this season, that the boundary markers along the old stone wall needed resetting, that he'd caught the drifting edge of something wrong in the wind off the blighted hollow and gone to investigate. All of that was even true in its way. But Ianthe had stood at his shoulder since they were pups tumbling in the lodge yard together, had held the pack's second seat at his side for 6 years now through 2 hard winters and 1 harder grief, and he found, turning the cold cup once more in his hands, that he did not have it in him to hand her anything but the truth. I found her, he said, the mate bond. It's real, Ianthe. I felt it tonight, whole and sudden like. He stopped because there was no good way to finish that sentence that did not sound like something out of the old stories the elders told pups at the hearth, the kind of tale you were meant to grow out of believing applied to you specifically. Like the ground opening under a held breath. I didn't know it would feel like that. Ianthe went very still. Not the stillness of surprise. He knew her too well for that. But the stillness of someone doing careful, rapid arithmetic behind quiet eyes.
Who? She said.
Not a question so much as a demand for the one fact that would tell her how much trouble they were in. He hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. Reese. A woman from the village, he said. The beekeeper. Hazel Vane's granddaughter. I think. She has the old cottage at the wood's edge, the one with the hives. Ianthe closed her eyes briefly, as if praying to some patient god for strength, and when she opened them again there was no anger in her face, which was somehow worse than if there had been. There was only a weary, careful worry, the same look she wore when a storm was building over the ridge, and there was nothing to be done about it but watch it come. A human, she said. From Fenbrook. I know. You know what the village thinks of us. What they've thought of us since before either of us was whelped. They keep their children in after dark and nail iron over their door frames and tell each other stories about what happened to old Bram Alder's sheep 30 years back, and not one word of it kind. And you want to walk a bond thread straight into the middle of that. I don't want anything, Reese said, though even as he said it he heard how little truth was left in it. I didn't ask for this, Ianthe. It found me. You know how the bond works. It isn't a want, it's a knowing. I looked at her, and some part of me that's been asleep my whole life sat up and said there, that one. No arguing to be done about it. The elders will argue plenty. The elders can argue with the moon for putting the bond in me in the first place. But there was no real heat in it. He heard his own tiredness under the words, the particular tiredness of a man who had been alpha of this pack for 4 years and carried every one of its old wounds like stones in his chest, and who knew precisely how thin the ice was that any friendliness toward the village would have to cross. Fenbrook had not forgiven Thistlemore for a killing none of the pack now living had committed. Thistlemore had not forgiven Fenbrook for the traps, the poisoned meat, the winter 3 alphas back when 6 of the pack's own had been lost to men with torches and old grudges. It was not a wound that healed clean. It only scarred over thin and split again at the first hard knock. I'm not telling you to fight the bond, Ianthe said, more gently now, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees. I've seen what happens to wolves who try that. It doesn't end well, and it doesn't end quiet either. It eats a person hollow. I'm telling you to be careful. If this gets out before you've found solid ground to stand on, it won't just be your grief to carry. It'll be trouble for the whole pack, and trouble for her too, likely worse than for you. Village folk have burned less for less in the old days. I know it. He set the cold tea aside at last, untouched, and rubbed a hand over his face, feeling every one of the hours since dusk in the ache behind his eyes. I'm not going to do anything foolish, Ianthe. I only went to see what was disturbing the boundary wards near her fences. That part was true enough. I didn't go looking to find my mate standing in the moonbriar with a basket on her arm, looking at me like she'd known me all her life and hadn't yet decided if that pleased her or frightened her half to death. Something almost like a smile touched Ianthe's mouth then, brief and rueful. And which was it? Both, Rhys admitted. I think both in about equal measure. He looked toward the shuttered window, toward the dark bulk of the wood beyond it, and the wall beyond that, and, past even that, the small stone cottage with its rows of quiet hives where he supposed she was sleeping now, or trying to. The thread in his chest pulled gently toward her even here, patient as a compass needle, careless of every good reason he had to ignore it. I don't know what I'm meant to do with this, Ianthe. I only know I'm not sorry it found me, whatever trouble comes of it after. Ianthe studied him a moment longer in the dying firelight, and whatever she saw seemed to settle something in her, because she rose at last and laid a hand briefly on his shoulder, second and friend both in the gesture. Then we'd best find out what kind of trouble, before it finds us first, she said. Sleep if you can. Moonbriar keeps till morning, and so do hard decisions. She left him there before the banked coals, and Rhys sat a long while yet, listening to the wood settle into its deep night hush, feeling the thread in his chest hum quiet and constant as a bee's wing, and did not, in the end, manage to sleep at all. Chapter 4. Rhys told himself, walking the fence line at Mari Vane's apiary in the gray hour after dawn, that he had come because 2 of his younger wolves had reported straying too near the beekeeper's land in the night, and a responsible alpha looked into such things himself. He told himself this quite firmly 3 separate times, and did not believe it any of the 3. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. The thread in his chest had tugged him awake before first light, patient and insistent as a hand at his sleeve, and he had dressed and walked the long way round through the trees rather than lie in his bed pretending he did not feel it. He was Alpha of Thistlemore. He answered to no one for where he walked his own borders. And yet he had chosen the excuse about the wolves before he'd even reached her fence, the way a man rehearses a lie he expects to need. The mist still lay low over the meadow grass when he came within sight of the hives, a dozen pale boxes ranged in crooked rows behind the cottage, and he heard them before he saw her. That low, uneven hum, ragged at the edges, like a hymn sung by a choir short several voices. He had heard healthy hives before, in the old days, when his grandfather still spoke of the Amber Accord as living history rather than half-forgotten story. This was not that sound. This was a sound with worry threaded through it. Then Mari stepped out from behind the end hive, sleeves pushed to her elbows, a smoker cold and unlit in one hand, and the thread in his chest pulled so hard he nearly stopped walking. She saw him at the same moment and went still, wariness sliding over her features like a shutter closing. "You're on my land again," she said, not unkindly but not warmly either. "2 of my pack reported wolves ranging close to your fences 3 nights running," Rhys said, which was true, if not the whole truth. "I came to see for myself."
"And did you?"
"See for yourself." "I will," he said, "if you'll let me walk the line." She considered him a long moment, arms crossing over her chest, and he watched her decide something, watched the wariness lose by a narrow margin to whatever else moved beneath it. Curiosity, maybe, or simply the exhaustion of a woman with too much land and too little help to turn away an offer of eyes and hands, even wolf eyes, even a wolf's hands. Fine, she said, but you stay on the outside of the hives. They're skittish enough without a stranger crowding them. He meant to keep his distance. Truly he did. But the hives were between him and the fence line he'd claimed to have come for, and so he found himself walking nearer to them than he'd intended, near enough to see the sparse, listless drift of bees at the entrance boards, near enough to feel that low worried hum resonate faintly in his own chest alongside the thread that already lived there. The change was immediate, and it startled them both. The hum steadied. Not loudly, not dramatically. No bees rose in alarm. No wings roared to sudden life, but the ragged edge smoothed out of the sound, like a held breath finally released, and the bees at the nearest entrance began moving in something closer to the orderly rhythm he dimly remembered from childhood summers, in and out, purposeful instead of wandering. Mari's head turned sharply toward the hive, then toward him, her eyes narrowing with a suspicion that had nothing to do with wariness of wolves and everything to do with the beekeeper noticing something her hives had never done before. What did you just do? Nothing, Reese said honestly. I only walked closer. Do it again. He glanced at her, faintly amused despite himself. Closer or farther? Farther. Then closer again. I want to see if it's you, or if I imagined it. He obliged, stepping back 3 long paces toward the fence, and the hum roughened again, subtly. The bees at the entrance board slowing their traffic into something more uncertain. Then he stepped forward, back into the space he'd occupied before, and the sound steadied once more, smoothing under some influence he could not name and had certainly never been taught to command. Mari stared at him the way she might have stared at a fox found sitting politely at her kitchen table. That's not natural. No, Reese agreed. I don't imagine it is. Do you know why? He thought of Ianthe's careful, unsettled face by the firelight, of the words fated mates sitting heavy and unspoken between them still. He was not ready to hand her that particular truth, not here in the cold morning mist with her arms crossed and her trust so plainly not yet his to keep. No, he said, which was not quite a lie either. Only a smaller truth standing in front of a larger one. But my grandfather used to say the old alphas had some manner of understanding with the bees on this land, long before either of our times. Something flickered across her face at that. Recognition, maybe, or the ghost of a memory not quite hers. My grandmother used to say something like that too, she admitted slowly, as though the words cost her something to give up. Come inside a moment. I want to show you what she left. He had not expected the invitation, and by her expression, neither had she, quite, until it was already out of her mouth. But she turned toward the cottage without waiting to see if he'd follow, and he found that he would have followed her through considerably worse than an open doorway. The kitchen was small and warm and smelled of beeswax and old paper and the particular sweetness of honey gone slightly to crystal in its jars. Mari cleared a space at the table with the brisk, unthinking efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times for 1,000 ordinary mornings, and set down in front of him a stack of ledgers so water-stained and swollen with age that their covers had rippled like bark. My grandmother kept records on every hive back to when she was a girl, she said, opening the topmost one to a page dense with cramped, looping handwriting, half of it blurred where damp had gotten in. Weights, weather, which queens took and which failed, when the bees swarmed and where they went. I used to think it was just habit, carefulness. But look here. She turned several pages, found what she wanted, and slid the book toward him. Every full moon, she notes something odd. Bees settling early. Hives quieter than they ought to be, or louder. She never explains it, just notes it, like she expected someone to ask someday and wanted the answer ready. Reese bent over the water-stained page, and the handwriting there, patient, exacting, half a lifetime of small, quiet devotion pressed into ink, stirred something in him that had nothing to do with the thread in his chest and everything to do with the weight of history he'd been raised inside without ever fully understanding its shape. Did anyone ever ask her? Not that I know of. Mari's voice had gone softer, the wariness in it thinning to something more like the ache of missing someone. She died before I thought to. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it entirely. She looked up at him then, and for a moment the careful distance between them wavered, thinned by shared curiosity into something almost like ease. Two people bent together over an old woman's careful handwriting, each holding half a question the other might, unexpectedly, help answer. You said your grandfather spoke of some old understanding, she said, between the alphas and the bees.
He did.
I never thought much of it. Old men's stories, I assumed. Reese turned another page, careful with the swollen paper, and did not look away from it when he added, quieter. I'm no longer so certain. Mari didn't answer right away. She only reached across and turned back to an earlier entry, one dated some 40 years past, and set her finger beside a line where the ink had run so badly only a few words survived legible. The old pact, it read, and beneath it, fainter still, sealed in blood and kept in honey. Outside, faint through the shuttered window, the hum of the hives went on steady and low, settled now, waiting. Chapter 5. The visits became a habit before Mari quite noticed it happening. Reese came the following evening under the excuse of checking the fence line again, and the evening after that with no excuse at all, simply appearing at the edge of the garden as the light went gold and thin, as if the hour itself summoned him. She told herself she allowed it only because the bees kept their strange calm whenever he was near, and because Hazel's ledgers were easier to puzzle through with a second set of eyes. She did not examine too closely why she found herself listening for a step on the path, or why the kitchen felt larger and colder on the evenings he did not come. On the third such evening, with rain threading soft silver lines down the window panes and the fire snapping low in the grate, Reese set aside the ledger he had been frowning over and looked instead at her, his amber eyes catching the firelight in a way that still made something in her chest turn over helplessly. My grandfather used to say the pact was struck in blood and kept in honey, he said. I heard it as a child and thought it was only a saying, the way old wolves have sayings for everything, for the moon, for the hunt, for grief. I didn't think there was history under it. Mari drew her shawl closer and settled into the chair across from him, her own cup of chamomile forgotten and cooling between her palms. And now I've watched my great-grandmother's granddaughter's bees go quiet at my footstep 3 evenings running, when by every account they ought to have stung me half to death for daring to come this close to the hives. He said it lightly, but there was a weight beneath the words, the weight of a man turning over a stone he had stepped past his whole life and finding, for the first time, something alive beneath it. She wanted to laugh, but the wanting caught in her throat instead, because she had felt it too, the way the hum outside had gentled the moment he crossed the threshold, the drones and workers alike easing into a low, steady murmur, as if some old anxious watch in them had finally been relieved. She had not told him that she had once, foolishly, pressed her palm flat to the warm wood of a hive box just to see whether the sound would change if she thought of him standing where he stood now. It had. Tell me the rest of it, she said. Whatever your grandfather told you, even the parts that sound like nothing. So he told her. Generations back, he said, so many that even the pack's oldest memory keepers argued over the count. The very first alpha of Thistlemore had been a hard, hungry man in a hard, hungry age, when the wood itself had teemed with things far crueler than wolves, and the pack's numbers had been thin enough that a single bad winter might have ended them entirely. With her, or with whoever kept her hive at the time, the fire popped and settled, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the quiet of the little kitchen filling up with everything they had not yet found words brave enough to hold. Mari looked at the ledger between them, at Hazel's careful failing hand, at the faded line that read sealed in blood and kept in honey, and understood, with a chill that was not entirely fear, that her grandmother had known far more of this than she had ever let show, and had left, somewhere in all those water-stained pages, whatever truth she had been too frightened or too determined to speak aloud while she still had the chance. Chapter 6. The shrine did not look like much at first, a low mound of stones half swallowed by moss, tucked into a fold of the wood where the trees grew, so close together their branches wove into a ceiling, and the light that reached the ground came green and dim, like light falling through water. Mari would have walked past it entirely if Rhys had not stopped, one hand lifting to still her before she stepped past a fallen log slick with lichen. "Here," he said, and something in his voice had gone quiet and careful, the way a man's voice goes quiet in a place he was taught as a boy to be quiet in. She followed his gaze and saw it then. Not a mound at all, but a structure, its shape given away by the straight edges beneath the moss, a lintel over what had once been a doorway, now collapsed to knee-height, choked with bramble and years. Old stone, gray going to green, carved in a style she did not recognize, and yet somehow, standing there with the hush of the wood pressing close around her, did not feel foreign either. It felt like something she had forgotten rather than something she had never known. What is this place? The old shrine. What's left of it? Rhys crouched at the collapsed doorway, clearing a hank of bramble with careful hands, mindful, she noticed, of his own strength, the way he was always mindful around her, as though he measured every motion against how easily it might break something smaller than himself. "My grandfather brought me here once, when I was young enough that I didn't understand what he was showing me. He said it was old before the pack was old. Older than Fenbrook. Older than the Moonbriar, maybe, though nothing's supposed to be older than the Moonbriar in this wood." Mari knelt beside him, her skirts damp instantly through from the moss, and did not care. Up close the carvings resolved out of the stone the way shapes resolve out of fog, slowly, and then all at once. It means everything, if I'm reading this right. Rhys brushed moss from a lower panel, and here the carving grew more detailed, more legible, as though whoever had cut it had wanted this part especially to survive the weathering of centuries. A figure with the wolf's proportions, but standing as a man might stand, one hand extended, and facing him a woman with a woven basket at her hip and bees rising from it in a loose spiral. The two figures reaching toward each other across a gap the stonecutter had left deliberately open, so that the eye leapt the distance the hands could not quite close. Beneath them both, small and easy to miss, a crescent moon shone full and round, not crescent at all, and beneath that a line of old lettering worn nearly smooth. Mari traced it with 2 fingers, feeling for shape more than sight. "I can't read this." "Neither can I, not all of it. But I know some of the old words, the ones my grandfather taught me before he died, the ones nobody bothers with anymore, because there's no one left who needs them." Rhys leaned close, close enough that she felt the warmth of him along her side, steady as a hearth, and something in her chest loosened at it even now, even with her heart hammering at what the stones seemed to be telling her. "This word here, kin, and this one I think it means renew or close to it. And here." His fingers stopped beneath the full round moon. "This is unmistakable. It's not a phase, it's the whole of it. Full. Renewed by kin," Mari said slowly. beneath a full moon. By Bloodkin, Rhys said. By the same line that struck the first bargain. Not by anyone who happens to keep bees.
By you, Mari.
Or no one. The words settled over her like a weight she had been carrying without knowing its shape, and now, set down and seen plainly, she understood why her shoulders had ached for weeks without cause. She sat back on her heels in the moss and looked at the carved woman with her basket of rising bees, and thought of Hazel's hands, always faintly gold with propolis no matter how often she scrubbed them, and Hazel's silences, which Mari had always taken for grief and now wondered, with a chill that climbed slow up her spine, whether some of them had been fear instead.
She knew, Mari said.
She had to have known. All those years, tending the old queen's line like it was sacred, never selling, never explaining why, just, the bees know sorrow, the bees remember. She knew what they were for, and she never told me. Maybe she meant to. Rhys said it gently, the way he'd said the ward is dying with them, not softening the shape of the thing, but easing the weight of how it landed. Maybe she ran out of time. Grief doesn't wait politely for the right moment to have a conversation, and neither does dying. Mari pressed the heel of her hand briefly to her eyes, and when she lowered it, the shrine was still there, patient and old and carved with a promise she had apparently been born owing. Or maybe she was afraid of exactly this. Of me, out here in the dark, tangled up in wolf business and old magic, instead of safe behind my fences with my ledgers and my debts, ordinary and small and mine. You could still choose that, Rhys said, though it clearly cost him something to say it, his jaw tight, his amber eyes not quite meeting hers. I would not. I could not ask this of you, Mari. Not when I don't yet know the whole price of it. You're not asking. She looked at him, at the careful, contained ache in his face, the alpha of a pack who had just laid bare the one thing that might save his people, and in the same breath tried to hand her a door-marked leave, if you want to. I'm the one standing in a dead woman's shrine reading my own name in the stone, more or less. Nobody made me walk into this wood in the first place. I did that all on my own. That won her the faintest curve of his mouth, gone almost before it arrived. He reached out then, slow, the way he always moved around her, and brushed a fleck of moss from her temple, his fingers warm and steadying against her skin, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the wood holding its breath around them the way it seemed to do more and more when the two of them were close. Neither of them saw the shape at the treeline, still as the trunks around him, gray-muzzled and lean with a hunger that had nothing to do with meat. Garrick Sorrel had watched from the shadow of an old alder since before they'd found the doorway, his lip curling back off his teeth at the sight of the carvings uncovered after all this time, at the sound of the word Renew carried soft on the Alpha's voice. He had waited a long while for someone fool enough to walk this deep into what was left of the old bargain. He had not expected it to be so easy, nor so soon, nor to feel, watching them together in the green hush of the shrine, quite so much like watching two more things he intended to see broken. Chapter 7. The fire had burned low by the time Mari finally stopped shaking, though she would not have said, if asked, exactly when the shaking had started. Perhaps it had been the first moment she'd heard the sound outside her cottage window, a wrongness in the night too thick to be wind, too dry to be rain. Perhaps it had been earlier still, some part of her keeping vigil even as she slept, waiting for the wood to show her what it had been holding back. She had been dreaming of her grandmother's hands, steady and sure among the frames, when the smell reached her. Not smoke exactly, though it clung to the back of the throat the way smoke did. Something colder, something that smelled faintly of rot beneath the char, of a hollow tree long since gone soft and wet at its heart. She had sat up in the dark with her own heartbeat loud in her ears, and through the thin curtain she had seen them, 3 shapes gathered at the fence line, tall as men, and yet not men at all, their edges smoking and shifting like something only half committed to holding a shape. She did not remember deciding to scream. She remembered only that Reese was there before the sound had finished leaving her throat, as though he had been running toward her cottage before she had even known she needed him, as though some thread strung taut between them had gone singing the moment her fear woke. He came over the fence rather than through the gate, a gray blur, and then, impossibly, simply Reese, bare-chested in the cold with his jaw set and his eyes gone that deep amber they turned when the wolf in him rose close beneath the skin. He did not so much as glance at her. He put himself between her and the smoking shapes at the fence, and when the nearest one surged forward with a sound like a dying ember hissing in rain, he met it with his hands, with a snarl low in his chest that she felt in the boards of the porch beneath her bare feet. She should have run inside. She knew that, even as it was happening, some small, clear voice in the back of her mind reciting all the things a sensible woman would do. She did not run. She stood in her doorway with her grandmother's old iron poker gripped white-knuckled in both hands, and she watched Reese Thorne fight the dark the way she imagined the first alpha must have fought it, generations gone, back when the Accord was young, and the wood still remembered its bargain. The wraith things did not bleed. They came apart instead, wherever his hands or his will struck true, unraveling into threads of oily smoke that hissed and thinned and were gone, leaving behind only a smell like burnt honey and a cold spot in the air where each had stood. There were 3, and then there were 2, and then, as the last one lunged low for the place where her herb bed edged the porch steps, there was a sound she would remember for a long time after, a tearing snarl and a flash of claw, and Reese staggered back with a hand pressed to his own side. Reese. She was down the steps before she'd decided to move. Poker forgotten. Dropped somewhere in the dark grass. It's shallow. He said it through his teeth, which was not. She was fast learning. The same thing as true. But the last of the smoke had guttered out into nothing over the fence line, and the night had gone still again, ordinary and cold and smelling only of turned earth and coming frost, and there was no enemy left to hide the wound from. She got him inside by main stubbornness more than any strength of her own, got the fire built back up from its embers, got a basin of water, and the roll of clean linen she kept for the bees' sake more than her own, and knelt at his side on the hearth rug while he sat with his back against the settle and let her work, which she understood, even in her fright, to be its own kind of gift. A man used to being the one who tended did not surrender easily to being tended. The cut ran along his ribs, ugly but no deeper than a bad bramble scratch, already knitting closed at its edges in that quick way she had come to expect of him and had stopped, mostly, trying to explain to herself. She cleaned it with hands that would not quite stop trembling, and he watched her face instead of her hands the whole while, and neither of them spoke until the linen was tied, and the firelight had gentled the room back down into something that almost felt safe again.
"Those were the withering," she said at last.
Not a question. She had read enough of Hazel's ledgers by now, enough of the fragments Reese had shared from the pack's own memory, to know the shape of the thing even without ever having named it aloud before. Getting bolder. His voice had roughened, whether from the fight or from something else she could not tell. It shouldn't be able to reach this close to the village.
Not yet.
Not without the ward failing faster than we feared. Because of my hives. Because of the Accord. He said it gently, though it cost her nothing less to hear. You are not the only failing thing holding that ward up, Mari. Don't carry it all yourself. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, at the firelight moving amber and gold along the planes of his face, at the strange steadiness of him even now, even bleeding, even so plainly exhausted that his eyes had gone heavy-lidded with it. She thought of the warmth that had flooded her chest the very first night in the wood, the way it had never fully left her since, humming low and constant as a hive at rest, and she found she no longer had the strength to pretend she didn't know its name. "I feel it," she said, quiet, before she could talk herself out of the words. "Whatever this is between us. I've felt it since that first night. I thought I was imagining it, or that it was only the shock of seeing a wolf that large look at me like he knew me. But I don't think I imagined it. I don't think you do either." Something moved behind his eyes, something that looked, for just a moment, like relief, so total it was nearly pain. "No," he said. "I don't imagine it. I haven't been able to, no matter how many reasons I've given myself to try." "Then why do you look at me like it's a wound instead of a gift?" He was quiet long enough that the fire popped and settled twice before he answered, and when he did, his voice had gone low and rough with something that was not quite grief and not quite fear, but kin to both. "Because I am the alpha of a pack that has bled once already for trusting the village, generations back, and because pack law does not bend gently for men who let their hearts choose before their heads have finished counting the cost. Because if I am wrong about you, Mari Vane, it will not only be my heart that pays for it." He reached out, the way he always did, slow and careful, and laid his palm briefly against her cheek, warm despite the wound still knitting beneath his ribs. "And because I am not wrong about you, and that frightens me more than any wraith in that wood ever could." Outside, the last of the smoke smell was fading from the night air, chased off by wood smoke and the ordinary cold, and Mari leaned her cheek into his hand and let herself, just for this one held breath of firelit quiet, stop fighting the thing that had already chosen her back. Chapter 8. The trouble started, as trouble in Fenbrook often did. Overbread going cold in the baker's window while everyone stood outside talking instead of buying it. Mari heard it first from old Pruitt, who came to the apiary 2 mornings after the wraith attack with an excuse about buying comb honey for his wife's chest cough, though his wife had been dead 9 years and everyone in the village knew it. He lingered by the fence, turning his hat in his hands, and told her, not unkindly, that a traveler had come through Fenbrook the day before, a soft-spoken man with a limp and a walking stick who had heard, somehow, all about the smoke creatures at her cottage, and who had gone from the mill to the tavern to the chapel steps saying that such things had never troubled Fenbrook before the wolves grew bold, and wondering aloud, gently, so gently, whether a village so near a wolf would ought to keep, tolerating a pack that let its beasts run close enough to breathe smoke onto a decent woman's doorstep. "I didn't credit it," Pruitt said, not quite meeting her eyes. "But others might." Mari had gone still over the frame she was inspecting, bees drifting unbothered around her wrists, and asked what the stranger looked like, and Pruitt had shrugged and said ordinary, brown coat, quiet voice, the kind of man you forgot the moment he left a room, and something in the vagueness of it prickled at the back of her neck the way spoiled milk prickled at the nose before the eyes ever caught the smell. By the end of that week the story had grown legs of its own, the way stories did in a village small enough that everyone's business ran together like rainwater in a shared gutter. The wraiths, which no one but Mari and Reese had actually seen, became wolves in the retelling, the way Ianthe had once become a threat and the Moonbriar had once become poison, and Mari found herself, for the first time since her grandmother's funeral, met with something colder than pity when she came into the village for flour and lamp oil. Mistress Colm did not quite refuse to serve her, but took her coin with 2 fingers as though it might carry something catching, and the miller's boys who used to race each other to carry her baskets stood instead in a knot by the well, watching her with the particular wariness of children who have been told a frightening story by adults they trust. She did not see the traveler herself. She looked for him twice, walking the length of the high street with her basket on her arm and her jaw set, but he was, it seemed, always just gone, always just left by the North Road an hour before, always described a little differently by whoever had last spoken to him, until Mari began to wonder if he existed at all outside the shape of the fear he had planted, or whether that was precisely the sort of man who could do the most damage while leaving the least trace of himself behind. She told Rhys as much the next time he came, standing at the edge of her garden with his hands in his pockets, and a stillness about him that had not been there before, a stillness she was learning to read the way she read weather in a held breath before a storm. "Garrick," he said when she described the stranger, and the name came out of him low and certain, though he offered no more than that, only a muscle working once in his jaw before he made himself let it go, the way a man sets down a blade he is not yet permitted to use. "You think he means to turn the village against you?" "I think," Rhys said carefully, "that a man who has spent years alone with a grudge learns to be patient with it. He does not need the village to love him. He only needs it to fear us enough to make trouble easy." He did not touch her before he left, though his eyes lingered on her the way hands might have, and she stood at the fence long after he had vanished into the tree line, listening to the hush that had settled over the wood, and thinking that silence, she was learning, could ache every bit as fiercely as any wound that bled. Chapter 9. The hive had been humming for 300 years, or so Hazel used to say, ever since the first bondkeeper of Mari's line had set a wild queen loose in a hollow log and asked nothing of her but partnership. Mari had grown up believing that hum was as permanent as the creak at the bottom of the wood, as certain as the turning of the seasons. She learned otherwise on a morning, so still it felt wrong before she had even opened the lodge lid, before she had seen anything at all, simply because the air around the hive boxes carried no sound. She stood in the frost-silvered grass in her nightdress and shawl, having come out at first light from some instinct she could not name, and she already knew before she pried the lid free what she would find. The frames inside were dark with the bodies of bees, hundreds of them, clustered together in the shape of the warmth they had tried and failed to keep through the night. It struck her unprepared regardless. She went, because some stubborn thread of hope insisted she needed to see it with her own eyes rather than only hear it secondhand, and she stood at the edge of the clearing outside the lodge among a scatter of villagers who had come to gawk and mutter, and watched Rhys stand before his gathered pack with his shoulders set like a man bearing a weight he had chosen to carry alone. The elder who spoke was old Brona, her voice carrying easy and hard across the clearing. "The wraiths came to human land because our Alpha's heart strayed to human land," she said. "We do not say the fault is hers. We say the cost is ours to bear, and it grows heavier every day this bond between them continues unchecked. The pack is not safe while its Alpha's loyalty is divided." Mari watched Rhys's jaw tighten, watched the muscle there jump once, twice, and she willed him silently not to say what she could already feel building behind his eyes. But when he spoke, his voice pitched to carry to every wolf and villager in that clearing, it was not defiance she heard. "The pack's safety comes first," he said. "It has always come first. I will not let my own wanting endanger the people sworn to my protection." He did not look at her as he said it, though she thought, cruelly, that not looking at her must have cost him something too. "Whatever bond one believed I had found, I set it aside, for the pack's sake, until such time as it can be proven safe." It was almost the same thing he had told her at the fence 3 nights before, softened before by tenderness and a hand that had not quite touched her. Here, before the whole gathered pack and half the curious village, it sounded like an ending rather than a pause, and something in her simply gave way to hear it spoken so plainly into daylight, stripped of every gentleness he had tried to wrap around it in private. She did not wait to hear if there was more. She turned and walked back through the trees, past villagers who watched her go with the particular blend of pity and vindication Fenbrook reserved for anyone foolish enough to have hoped for something better than what the village expected of her, and she did not stop walking until she was back inside her own gate, among her own ruined hives, where at least the grief was honest and asked nothing false of her. She sat that evening at her grandmother's kitchen table with the ledgers open in front of her, unseeing, and let herself, for the first time since Hazel's funeral, think seriously about leaving. There was nothing left to keep her.
The queen was dead.
The accord, whatever it had truly required, seemed beyond her now to give. The man she loved had chosen his people over her in front of the whole village, and however much sympathy she could summon for the weight he carried, sympathy did not warm an empty bed or fill hive boxes gone silent and still. She thought of her cousin in the lowland town 2 days' ride south, who had written more than once offering a room and work in her dye shop. She thought of selling the land at last to whichever merchant kept circling with his too eager offers, of letting Thistlemore would keep its wolves and its magic and its grief, and of walking away from all of it with nothing but her grandmother's ledgers and whatever pride she had left. Outside, the wind moved through what remained of the apiary, stirring the empty frames with a small, hollow sound, and Mari pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes and let herself, finally, fully grieve for the hive, for the queen, for the bright, fragile things she and Rhys had built and which now lay as still and cold as anything else she had loved and lost in this house. Chapter 10. The grief did not lift so much as it settled, sinking into her bones the way cold settled into the ground before frost. Mari sat among the ruined hives until the sun climbed past the tree line and the dew burned off the grass, and still she did not move, because moving meant deciding what came next, and she had no decisions left in her that did not taste of ash. It was the empty hive boxes that finally drove her up. She could not bear to look at them any longer, stacked in their rows like small white coffins, and so she began, with no clear purpose beyond needing her hands to do something other than shake, to sort them. The newer boxes she set aside for burning, since disease sometimes lived in old wax and she would not risk it spreading, though she doubted now there would be anything left to protect. The older ones, her grandmother's boxes, worn silver gray with weather and age, she meant only to stack against the shed wall. The oldest of them all, the first hive Hazel had ever kept, resisted her when she lifted it, some warped board catching against its neighbor, and in freeing it the whole bottom board shifted beneath her palm with a give that should not have been there. Mari went still. She had cleaned this box 100 times as a girl, scraped its comb, breathed its smoke. She knew its weight, its balance, the particular creak of its old joints.
This was not that.
She turned it over in the thin autumn light and pressed again at the base, and this time she saw it, a seam so fine it might have been mistaken for the natural split of aged wood, running along the inside edge of the floor. She worked her thumbnail into it without much hope, expecting only rot, and the panel lifted away whole into her hand, revealing a shallow hollow beneath, dry as a held breath, and inside it a bundle wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and brown with years. Her fingers did not want to work properly as she untied the string. She had to stop once and press her wrist to her mouth before she could go on. When the cloth finally fell open across her knees, it was a book that lay inside it, small and thick, bound in the same cracked leather as the ledger she already knew by heart, but this one she had never seen. Across the front, in her grandmother's looping, impatient hand, were 3 words, for her after. Mari sat down hard in the grass. She read by the gray morning light with the ruined hive still open beside her, and Hazel's voice came up off the page so vividly that for whole sentences at a time Mari forgot to grieve at all, forgot everything but the sound of her grandmother scolding her from 30 years in the past. There was the ordinary keeping of bees in it at first, weather and swarms, and the price of sugar syrup, and Mari almost let herself believe that was all it held. Then, perhaps a third of the way through, the hand grew smaller, more careful, as though Hazel had chosen these words with more weight than the rest. "I have let this house believe the accord lives in the queen," Hazel had written because it was easier than telling the truth, and because I was afraid, and because once I understood what the telling would cost, I could not make myself say it to a living soul, not even my own daughter, may she forgive me for it wherever she is now. The wolves believe it too, or let themselves believe it, because a queen bee is a small, clean thing to hang a legend on, easier to love than a woman's fear. But I have stood beneath that moon myself, and I will set it down here plain so that whoever comes after me need not fumble in the dark as I did. The bond was never in the bee. The bee is only the shape love takes when it has somewhere to go. What holds the ward is the bond keeper's own heart, given whole and without holding back, to the wolf and to the wood both, on the night the moon stands fullest. I could not do it. I loved your grandfather, God rest him, and knew I would love no wolf the way the accord asked, and so I turned from Thistlemore and let the ward thin under my care, and told myself a story about a magic bee so that no one, myself least of all, would have to say I had failed a duty out of an old, private cowardice. If the wolves are dying by the time you read this, know that it is my doing as much as any blight's, and know too that it is not too late for you, if you have found in yourself a courage I never had. Mari read it 3 times through, and each time the words settled a little deeper, until they no longer felt like her grandmother's confession, but like something she had always half known, and simply lacked the courage to name. The queen had not been the key. The queen had only ever been the shape her own love had not yet found the nerve to take. She thought of Rhys's hand at the small of her back as they'd stood before the shrine's broken carvings, of his voice gone rough when he'd said the word mate as though it cost him something to let it be true out loud. She thought of standing in the square while the elders looked at her like a wound in the pack's side, and of Rhys stepping back from her because pack law told him to, and she understood now, with a clarity that felt almost cruel in how simple it was, that none of that mattered to what the accord required. It had never asked the elders' blessing. It had never asked the village's trust. It asked only her, and what she was willing to give freely, with nothing held back. She was on her feet before she had fully decided to be, the journal clutched to her chest, the empty hive forgotten behind her. The moon would stand full again tonight. She had marked its swelling for a week without letting herself think why. There was no time to send word to Rhys, and some small, stubborn part of her did not want to. He had chosen his people once already. Tonight she would choose on her own, without waiting on any man's permission to be brave. She took the path through Thistlemore Wood that she and Rhys had walked together, though alone it felt narrower, the shadows thicker, the old fear of the trees pressing close in a way it had not since her very first night among them. The moonbriar should have been thick along the stream bank by now, fat buds waiting for dusk to open them silver. Instead, she found the vines blackened at the root, curling in on themselves like something scalded, and where the ground had been torn to check them she saw, pressed deep into the mud, the print of a boot heel and, beside it, half buried, a small clay jar stopped with wax. Her hands trembled as she worked the wax free. Inside, the paste was dark and bitter-smelling, the same rot-sweet stink she remembered from the wraith's passing, and she understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, that the moonbriar had not been dying on its own. Someone had been feeding this into the roots, patient and unseen, killing the one plant that fed both bees and ward alike, season after season, long before her queen had ever failed. She thought of the stranger who had stirred the village against the wolves, of the too smooth sympathy in his voice, and beneath it, older and colder, of a name Rhys had spoken only once, with a flatness that had not invited questions.
Garrick.
An exiled wolf with grievance enough to want the whole accord broken rather than mended. Mari knelt there a long moment with the jar in her hand and the journal at her hip, the wood gone hushed and watchful around her, and felt the last of her grief burn down into something harder and far more useful. She was done fleeing to Lowland eye shops. She was done waiting to be chosen. Whatever waited for her at the shrine tonight, wolf or wraith or her own long-buried courage, she would meet it walking forward. And she rose and went on toward the failing light with the poisoned root still cupped, like evidence, like a promise, in her closed hand. Chapter 11. The shrine came upon her all at once, the way sacred places did, as though the wood itself decided the moment she deserved to see it. The clearing opened beneath a sky gone deep violet, the full moon already climbing free of the black lace of branches, huge and close and the color of clarified honey. The old stones stood in their broken circle as she and Rhys had left them, moss-quilted and leaning, but the air within that circle was different now. It hummed. It pressed against her skin like the inside of a struck bell. Garrick was already there. He stood at the center, where the shattered altar stone lay tilted on its side, and in the moonlight he looked less like a man and more like something carved from old grievance, hollow-cheeked, his eyes lit with a feverish amber that was Rhys's color gone wrong, curdled. Moonbriar vines, black-veined and weeping a tardark sap, coiled up through the cracked stone at his feet, and where they touched the ground the grass shriveled to ash-gray threads. "There she is," he said, and his voice had the same smooth, sympathetic warmth she remembered from the stranger in the village square, the mask not even fully dropped. The bond-keeper's blood, come to finish what her grandmother lacked the spine for. Mari's hand tightened around the poisoned root in her pocket. "You did this. The blight, the moonbriar, all of it. You told the village to fear the wolves so no one would look at what was really killing the wood." "I told the village the truth wrapped in a bough they'd swallow." Garrick tilted his head, almost fond, the way one might regard a clever child. The accord was always a leash, a pack that kneels to a beekeeper's mercy season after season, begging honey to keep its own magic alive. I mean to break it. Let the ward fall, let the withering scour this wood clean, and when it is done there will be no accord left to bind Thistlemore to anyone. Only wolves free, as we were before your family put a collar on us and called it a blessing. That isn't freedom. Mari made herself walk forward, though her legs wanted otherwise, though the wraith smoke was already threading up between the stones at the clearing's edge, thin dark ribbons gathering weight and hunger with every heartbeat. That's just a different kind of dying. You're not undoing the accord, Garrick. You're strangling it. And it's killing you too. Look at yourself. Look at what it's cost you already. Something flickered behind his eyes. There and gone. An old wound she had no name for. Then it hardened over. Save your pity for something that wants it. The wraiths came faster now, spilling from the shadows between the stones like ink dropped in water, formless and cold, and Mari felt the same bone-deep wrongness she had felt the night they'd swarmed her cottage, a hunger with no mouth, reaching for anything warm enough to hollow out. She backed against the broken altar, journal and jar both forgotten for one white-edged moment as the dark closed in. Then Rhys was there. He came out of the trees already changing, wolf to man in one fluid, moon-silvered motion, and put himself between her and the nearest wraith with a snarl that cracked through the clearing like a felled branch. Ianthe was a half-step behind him, and two more of the pack beyond her, but it was Rhys's amber eyes that found Mari's across the smoke, and in them she saw relief and terror braided so tightly together she could not have separated them if she tried. "Get behind me," he said low, urgent, already moving to make it true.
No.
The word came out steadier than she felt. "I have to do this, Reese.
Me.
Not you, not the pack. It has to be the bondkeeper." His jaw worked. For one terrible instant, she thought he would argue, would try to shield her the way the elders had taught him a good alpha must, distance itself and stand between his people and danger even when the danger wore the shape of the person he loved. But something in her face must have told him arguing would cost more than it saved, because instead he simply nodded once and turned to keep the wraiths from closing the last few feet between the dark and her back. Mari knelt at the cracked altar stone. She drew out Hazel's journal, the poisoned root, and last, the small clay jar of moonbriar honey she had carried the whole way from the ruined hives, the very last of it, dark as amber and still faintly warm from her own body's heat. Garrick's laugh cracked out, brittle. "That's your great renewal? A jar of dead honey and a girl's foolish heart." "It was never about the honey," Mari said, and found, as she said it, that she believed it entirely. "It was never about having a magical queen bee at all. My grandmother knew that. She just never had the courage to say it out loud, because saying it meant giving something of herself instead of something that could be replaced." She opened the jar and pressed her palm flat over the cracked stone, honey and skin both, the old carved grooves of bee and wolf intertwined, biting faintly into her hand. "The accord isn't sustained by magic. It's sustained by love, freely given, generation after generation. That's what a bondkeeper keeps, not a hive, a promise." She looked up, past Garrick, through the smoke and the snarling and the moon's huge gold face, and found Reese watching her with his whole heart naked in his eyes. "I love you," she said, simply, because there was no more elegant way to say the truest thing she knew, and because the moon deserved the truth as much as he did. "I love you, and I choose this, all of it, the pack and the wood and you, not because some old carving says I must, but because I want to. That is the accord. That has always been the accord." The stone beneath her palm went warm, then hot, then blazing, and light poured up out of the crack in a slow gold tide, moving like honey itself, like sunlight remembering how to be liquid. Reese was beside her in an instant, his hand closing over hers atop the stone, his voice joining low beneath hers in words neither of them had been taught and both somehow knew, and the light surged brighter, catching the black-veined vines and burning through them like dawn burning off frost. Garrick screamed, not in pain alone but in fury, in grief, as the stolen power he had twisted around himself unraveled thread by thread, the borrowed dark peeling off him and dissolving into the gold. The wraiths shredded to smoke and then to nothing, wisps of ash caught up and carried off on a wind that smelled, all at once, of warm wax and clover and rain-washed pine. And Mari knelt there in the blazing heart of it, Reese's hand locked over hers, the whole wood holding its breath around them, and felt the old wound in the world begin, at last, to close. Chapter 12. The gold light did not fade so much as settle, sinking into the earth like rain into thirsty soil, and for a long moment Mari knelt there with Reese's hand still locked over hers atop the shrine stone, both of them breathing hard, neither willing to be the first to move and prove it had truly ended. Around them Thistlemore wood exhaled. That was the only word for it. The black-veined blight that had crept along every root and branch loosened its grip all at once, and the air filled with the smell of turned earth and green sap and, underneath it all, faint and sweet and unmistakable, the smell of moonbriar opening. She looked up. Where the vines had strangled the old trees, pale buds were already unfurling, silver white in the moonlight, trembling open petal by petal as though the wood had simply been waiting for permission. Garrick was gone. The stolen dark that had wrapped him unraveled to nothing, and whether he had fled or been undone with it, Mari could not have said, and found she did not, in that moment, have room to care. There was only the light, and the flowers, and Rhys's hand over hers, warm and solid and shaking very slightly, the way her own was. "It's done," she whispered, because someone had to say it, and it seemed a shame for the wood to hear it from anyone but her. "It's begun," Rhys said, and when she turned to look at him properly, she found him already looking at her. Amber eyes bright even in shadow, his face open in a way she had rarely seen it. All the careful Alpha's guardedness burned away along with the blight. "Both, maybe. I don't think there's a difference tonight." They walked out of the shrine, clearing hand in hand, and the wood walked with them in its way, moonbriar blooming along the path as if lit by their passing, the old stunted brambles Mari remembered from her single terrified dash through these trees, now heavy and silver and humming, actually humming, with the drowsy contentment of bees that had found, after a long winter, exactly what they had been looking for. She recognized the sound before she saw them. Her bees, scouts from her weakest hive, the one she'd been certain would not survive the week, threading through the new blossoms in loose gold spirals, drunk on nectar that had not existed an hour before. Mari laughed, a startled, disbelieving sound, and pressed her free hand to her mouth.
"They found it already," she said.
"They always find it first. They're bond keepers too in their way," Rhys said. "Your grandmother would say so, I think." They did not go far before Ianthe met them on the path, and behind her a knot of pack members who must have felt the change in the ward the way Mari imagined a held breath might feel its own release, drawn out of the lodge and into the moonlit trees without quite knowing why. Ianthe's eyes went first to Rhys, cataloging him for injury in the swift, practiced way Mari had come to recognize, and then to Mari herself, and something in the second's face eased that Mari had not realized was tight. "The elders will want to see this," Ianthe said, nodding at the blooming wood, though her mouth had the beginning of a smile in it she did not quite let loose. "And you too. Both of you. Together, I'd think, this time." Word outran them back to the lodge, as word does in a pack bound close by scent and instinct as much as gossip, and by the time Mari and Rhys came into the firelit clearing before the great lodge doors, most of Thistlemoor's people were already gathered, drawn from their beds and their patrols, wolf-eyed even in their human shapes, watching the newly blooming edge of the wood with an awe Mari understood completely, because she felt it too, standing in the middle of it as though she had wandered into someone else's dream and found it was also, somehow, hers. The elders were not slow to speak, this time in her favor. She heard Elder Wren's voice rise first, admitting plainly and without much grace that they had been wrong to press their alpha away from the one soul in a generation who could have saved them, and old Elder Corbin, gruffest of the council, went so far as to clasp Mari's hand in both of his gnarled ones and tell her that the wood remembered its debts even when foolish men forgot them. Mari, and used to apology from people who had eyed her with such suspicion only days before, found she did not need to hold on to the sting of it. The moonbriar was blooming. Her bees were humming through it in the dark. She let the old ache go the way she'd let go of so much this past season, gently, because gripping it would have meant less room for what was coming. What came, in the weeks that followed, was ordinary in the best and richest sense of the word. The elders opened the pack's western meadowland to her, the long sunlit slope where moonbriar grew thickest and wild clover ran gold to the treeline, and their Mari built new hive boxes with pack hands helping raise the timber, Rhys among them with sawdust in his dark hair and a crooked, unhurried smile he wore more and more easily now that he no longer had cause to hide it. Her weak hive strengthened first, then doubled, then swarmed twice before midsummer, healthy and busy and utterly unafraid of the wolves that loped past their fences, because the bees, it seemed, had always known what the villagers took longest to learn, that Thistlemoor's wolves were guardians, not threats, bound to the same ward the bees themselves now fed. Fenbrook softened too, slowly, the way ice softens under a sun that has finally decided to stay. The stranger who had stirred the village against the pack was never seen again once his lies about the Wraith attack unraveled alongside Garrick's stolen power, and in his place came something Mari had not dared hope for. Neighbors walking the old cart track to Thistlemoor's border with jars to trade for honey, children daring each other to wave at the wood's edge and finding, to their delighted shock, a wolf sometimes waving back with a dip of its great head. The end. Thank you for listening to The Amber Hive. If you enjoyed this story, a new full-length audiobook in the Moonlit Bonds series arrives every week. Until next time, good night.